All right. Well, welcome everyone to our Klaas U webinar, hosted by Klaas Financial. I am Nate Bribey. I'm an investment advisor down here in our Loves Park office, and we also have Alyssa here with us as well. Go ahead, Alyssa, introduce yourself.
Hey everyone, my name is Alyssa Ebert. I'm also a fellow advisor down in the Loves Park office.
And tonight we're going to be talking about college planning, financial planning, education planning, as it relates to our students, going into college in the near future or any that may be on the tail end of it, starting to look at their student loans and what options they have there. So really excited for the webinar tonight to kind of go over some of the basics that you may have already heard, but also some more details about what you can do on the front end, what families can do as far as researching costs beforehand before they fall in love with the school, what they should know on the back end as far as loans, repaying, and who is responsible for what and what kind of those payment looks like. So what we'll do, we'll run through some slides. We have an hour here, an hour to go through this. We will try to take questions as we go through. So at the bottom, you should see a raise hand feature or a chat and Q&A feature, I'm sorry. So the Q&A feature at the bottom would be a great place to ask questions as they come up. If we have time at the end, we should be able to use the raise hand feature to answer any live questions that we may have. So I think that's all the housekeepings we have. These are recorded, as you saw, and we'll post them on our website in a few weeks for where we post all our other Klaas U universities under resources and so forth on the website. So with that, we'll kind of get going with the presentation. This quote is definitely one we always like to start with and talking about how complex and emotionally fraught this decision can be for most families, where you have a young child, a young student who has all this potential in the world, right? We want to do everything we can for our children to get them into the school of their dreams and make some sacrifices potentially as parents on our personal finances to get them there. But we really want to do some digging to really explore the costs and the benefits as to what that can look like in the future. And that's kind of the whole point of this presentation is to be, a good shopper or a good buyer when it comes to the price of education and make sure it's a smart financial decision, not for you, only us as parents, but also for your students and what it may look like for their future. So, yep, go ahead, Alyssa.
Starting off, it's important to, of course, have a goal in mind. For some people, intrinsic motivation is different for everybody. Some people know that they want to cover the cost of college, regardless of what that is for their students. Some people have a specific dollar amount in mind, same as when you go car shopping. I want the car that I want, no matter what it costs, or I will never pay more than this for a car. College is the same for a lot of people, and every child is different. You could have three kids and they all have different paths, and maybe your goals for each child aren't equal in dollar cents. So it really starts with, what do you want to save for the child? How much can you save? What's realistic for your situation? And what do you think their college experience will look like? Large age gaps can, of course, pose a difference in what that dollar amount is going to cost. Or if you have one that wants to be an astrophysicist and maybe one that wants to explore and they don't know what they want to do. So helps to have a conversation, open conversation with anybody interested in planning for the student's college expenses, to have a starting point, what you're working toward.
Now, we all know the cost of school, college is expensive, right? And what this looks like, what this looks at is the inflation adjusted tuition and fees from 1994 to 2024. So basically picture this as how much more as a multiple is a 2-year public school, a 4-year um, private school represented by orange, and the public 4-year in-state university as it relates to 1994 dollars compared to 2022. So what it looks like for the public 4-year in-state university is twice as expensive after adjusting for inflation as it was in 1994. And a lot of us would scratch our heads to say, well, is the value of that degree increasing at that rate? And that's an argument for another day. But what most people can attribute to the price increase is labor costs. So it's been researched that as much as 60% of the increase in cost are directly associated with salary and benefits of the faculty. So, just keeping up with the cost of labor basically is one of the main drivers in the increase of tuition and fees as we look at it from an inflation adjusted perspective. So now one may also, could believe to say, well, maybe people believe that high prices signal high quality, right? So is there some gamesmanship there of just saying, hey, we can charge this much per year for school just because, it signals, higher quality to some families. So that's something we'll get into in a little bit there, but go ahead, Alyssa, for the next slide.
Mhm. So starting off, the biggest gray area for a lot of people is working toward what you're going to pay for college. Usually when your child is in high school, they really start to push FAFSA, and there's kind of this curtain in front of filing FAFSA and what that actually means at the end game for most people. What FAFSA is looking for is the schools that you're looking to send information to, what the school's cost of attendance is, and then using your information, your students' information to determine what the expected family contribution would be. And then the end result from that is the financial need you would have. For example, if a certain university had a $50,000 a year cost of attendance and the SAI, the student aid index, was determined to be $30,000, it would determine that 20,000 of that would be a financial need that would likely be met by either loan or grant assistance.
Yep. So that's a key term that you're going to hear a lot is being aware what your student aid index is. This is basically a way for the government to figure out what do we think that Nate Brybe's family can afford for our children, right? So it looks at what this chart is showing. The main driver of that is parental income. How much money do I make and my wife make per year is the main driver to what the government thinks we can afford per year to send our children to school. So, of course, assets come into play if we look at the purple box in the lower left quadrant of that chart there. So, some noticeable assets would be excluded from parents' assets from this calculation, mainly retirement accounts. So any balance you see in your 401k plan or an IRA is excluded from this calculation. But 529s are included in there as well, just for the student who's enrolling in school there. So a question would be, what can we do to lower our student aid index to potentially generate more financial need? And the main thing we look at is what can we do to drive down parental income? So this could be IRA contributions, 401k contributions, HSAs, tax loss harvesting, all these things that can potentially lower AGI would be a main driver to potentially get more, a lower student aid index to potentially generate a higher financial need that a school could potentially meet with some grants. So there, we have a link at the end that we can send out as to how to estimate this. That's kind of a good idea to see, well, what does the government think we can afford per year of school? But that's a term you're going to hear a lot is your student aid index that kind of sets all the kind of sets the baseline as to what level of school the government thinks you can afford. Now, that doesn't mean you have to pay that by any means, and that's the whole point of this presentation, but that's kind of a base point as to where that kind of will flush out for you. So next slide, Alyssa is going to go into, well, what can you do to show, what is my net price going to be? What tools can we use, to actually go past the cost of attendance to say, well, what do you think my student will pay at a certain university based on our situation?
Mm-hmm. So collegescorecard.ed.gov is a great tool to utilize that may not give you the exact. Of course, there are assumptions for housing and food, of course, and books and supplies can vary, transportation can vary. A lot of this can vary by the time you actually have your student enrolled. But if you have an idea of the direction that they're going, it's better than the shot in the dark of just picking a number and trying to plan around that, or assuming that what you're saving will be enough to meet the goal that you have. It will ask for some general input, income, assets, family size, It does help to have a direction of what your student may be interested in studying, even though that changes, I think, 8 to 10 times for the average freshman. And it's a great resource to find general demographics of the school that you're looking at. For example, if you're looking out of state, how many students from that school are out of state? And it may be a good indicator on whether the aid that they'll be able to provide would be what you guys are looking for your individual fit for a school.
So what this shows on the right here is, I believe this is for UW-Madison. The total cost of attendance is $30,400 for the year, they're saying. And based on the information we put in there, it generated a needs-based aid package of 25,000, 400 roughly. So the net price at the top is showing that off of the sticker price of $30,000 a year for UW-Madison, based on the family's student aid index and the potential grants they would receive from the state and the institution, they could be paying a net price of $5,000 per year for that school. So that's where the cost of attendance is often irrelevant for most families because not everyone, truly pays that. So we have a slide in a few slides that kind of goes over, Notre Dame, a very high cost of attendance school, to show a cool case study there. But the whole point is don't be, maybe not misled, but don't be, worried about, the cost of attendance because most schools, most students may not pay that based on their situation. So the next slide I'll go over, but we have some other resources that kind of narrow that down too. So we subscribe to a software called College Aid Pro, and what this does is a great way to kind of narrow down schools within your area based on your situation. So this software will allow us to generate a student aid index for our clients and show them, based on your situation, your students' test scores, class rank, fields of study, where should we even begin looking? The last thing we want to do is just send people to say, go look at Madison, go look at Northwestern, go look at, Illinois State or wherever, and just kind of blindly make a apply at a school without really understanding what does the end look like when things are all said and done. So on the left here, this is just picking on Notre Dame. It goes over, what's the cost of attendance? Well, the sticker price this year is $86,000. That's a huge, huge number, obviously. Going down a few lines, you see total need met percent, 100%. And we have a award letter in a couple slides that verifies this. But what we tell family is, don't be discouraged by that $86,000. If you have a very bright student who, has great test scores and is able to get into Notre Dame, but has a low student aid index and generates a significant financial need, Notre Dame generally meets 100% of that need. Okay, so there is a world where, bright students that may not have the best financial situation can pay significantly less than that $86,000. So this is just a good way to kind of screen schools to say, what schools should we even potentially look at to direct our student to that may have a more favorable financial aid package for a student. Second picture here is kind of a search tool. Oh, back one slide, please.
Oh, sorry.
A search tool that can look by a certain radius. We only want our student to be 200 miles away because we want to be able to drive there, if something happens, right? So we can filter by a certain radius for schools, and based on not only the family student aid index, their resources that they have pledged for this expense, kind of create a funding gap. So all the way on the right side, this can say, based on what the cost of attendance is for UW-Platteville, after some merit scholarships, here's the estimated 4-year cost. After we factor in the 20,000 or whatever we have saved in a 529 plan, the estimated funding gap over a 4-year period is $33,000. Okay, so that's a really good number to know, and that's where we have discussion with our clients as to who's going to pick up that tab, and is that even doable in your financial picture if the parents are taking out loans in their name or whatnot. So this is a great way to really, like we started with, start that conversation with your student to say, this is kind of, the family's budget, and, these are the schools that potentially fit that budget before we get all, fall in love with visiting a campus that we have no business really affording truly, and we get too far down that path. So go ahead. Next slide. This is another resource from College Ed Pro to kind of go over a budget, basically, line by line, who's paying what. So starting with the total cost of attendance, let's see here, maybe 6 lines down, you'll see that this will go over all 4 years for an undergraduate degree, inflating it each year, starting at 51,000, 52, 54, 56. So the total cost is estimated to be 214,000 for that 4-year degree. That is the cost of attendance, the sticker price, we like to call that. Based on the inputs we put in there, we estimate some needs-based aid of about 10,000 per year, knocking that net cost down to about 168,000. We assume this student has a little bit saved in 529 plans, so their budget is 8,300. That shows a funding gap of $160,000 if you're following along with me. Now, we'll get into this more in a second, but from that 160, this is where truly loans come into play for most people. And maybe this is an extreme example, but unfortunately, it's really not, that we do see higher amounts quite often for some of the schools our families are looking at. The federal direct student loan, this is the most a student can take out in their name, okay, per year. And it's use it or lose it. So this is where you have to have that tough conversation with your children is to, you know, hey, Bobby, you can only really take out so much per year, and that's about $27,000. So there's still a remaining funding gap of 133,000 for the parents to consider, you know, to fill that gap truly. So that's the tough conversations to have with your students is, who's picking up that tab? Where is that money coming from? And is that even doable in our financial plan? And once again, the whole point of all this is to do this before they really truly even step foot on campus and fall in love with the school, right? So we want to have these tough conversations because the worst thing to say is, if you get in, we'll figure it out. Well, who's figuring out $133,000, right? So we want to be realistic with that on the front end, and remove the emotion as much as possible, truly, before we get, 3 months away from going there type of thing. So
Mhm. Then once you do have your schools narrowed down and it's time to file for the FAFSA, you do want to make sure that you get on that earlier than later because there are certain grants that are state specific. In Illinois, they have the MAP grant. That's a grant that once it's dispersed and they have distributed it to X number of people per year and the funds run out for that academic year, then the funds are gone. So if you think you might be eligible, you do want to jump on that earlier than later. Usually the form is available October 1st. That can vary a little bit. Last year it was a little bit late, but generally speaking, it's available October 1st. And again, as we touched on a little bit before about what parent-owned assets are factored in, the FAFSA does exclude retirement accounts, life insurance plans, et cetera. And as a reminder, again, the FAFSA gives us the student aid index, which ultimately will determine what the financial need and aid offered is. So once you file the FAFSA, the information is set to the institutions that you would input. So if you're still at the point, October, maybe you're narrowed down between 2 to 3 schools, you can put in several institutions, but you'd want to include all of the institutions you're considering because then they receive that information and ultimately they'll use the information to feed you an award letter with what aid, either grant or loan that your student is eligible for or yourself as Parent Plus. If you are looking or your student is looking at a private school, there is a form CSS that you would want to fill out also. Private schools use that more so to determine not just need-based, like they do look a little deeper. It is about double the question load that the FAFSA gives off, and it does look at if the student has siblings with 529s, it looks at family farms, it looks at small businesses. It goes a lot deeper than the FAFSA does.
one comment on that too. There are multiple ways to calculate a student aid index, and another change that some schools look at home equity. So I always laugh at this, that you know, home to some schools, the equity you have in your home is almost as liquid and available as a checking account. So, think about that. Some schools say you have $300,000 of equity in your home. Just go ahead and take out a home equity and use that cash to pay for your students' college because we're going to view that just like you have 300,000 in a checking account. So, kind of the Wild West in some of these things, truly, the more we get into this, but thought that was a funny thing to share.
So then once your student's enrolled in an institution, they'll kick out the award letter to you, and these will include loan grant, and they also typically include work study programs, which at first glance of an award letter maybe is not highlighted loudly. So I always like to mention that because that assumes that your student maybe would want to work an on-campus job part-time during the semester. Perhaps they have their own plans for work or they don't plan to work at all. So it is important to know that that's inclusive. So when you're just looking at the bottom dollar amount of what is being offered, some of that may be an item that you may or may not reject. And then once the award letter is accepted and the student determines what they would like to move forward with from what is offered to them, then you would fall into the process of moving toward secondary funding sources that would be needed. So again, an award letter will include items, need-based grants. So that would be your either Pell grants or in Illinois, it could be a MAP grant that would not require a payment. They would include at the time also any merit-based aid from the university themselves. Of course, there's outside scholarship programs students can apply for third party to the university, but the award letter would generally include anything that the university themselves is offering. And then also wrapped into the award letter would include loans. And that's where sometimes people get thrown for a little bit of a loop. And that's where the words subsidized and unsubsidized, subsidized and unsubsidized come in that we'll get to in a little bit also. And then inclusive of the work study programs.
Yep. I would say on here too, it's important to understand if your family and student is a needs-based aid candidate or a merit-based aid candidate, where needs-based, we went over that already, but once again, if you have lower, parental income, only one, of the parents work, or maybe you're in a divorce situation or whatever, the reason, having a low single parent income it can be favorable from a needs-based perspective or low non-retirement assets. So certain schools, like we showed at Notre Dame, for example, or Northwestern here in Illinois, are very favorable if you're a bright student that have very generous needs-based aid program. So the whole point of this is don't be shy with the sticker prices. If you have a bright student that has a potential large financial need, some of those schools are could be worth applying to, and you could be very surprised with what you receive. Now, potentially most of the families we work with, being a wealth management firm, are maybe more merit-based candidates where they have higher student aid indexes. They have dual income households or one spouse that has significant income or significant assets where they say, well, that's great. I'm not getting any needs-based aid. What about me? Well, once again, this is where student test scores come in a lot, where those families should really focus on the students having high GPAs, the best they can, class rank, spending extra money on test prep for SAT, ACT, getting those scores up. Where a lot of schools we can see in the software are, you get this level of GPA and this level of ACT or SAT will give you X amount per year. It's that simple, that black and white. So spending a little bit extra money on test prep to get those standardized test scores up could move the needle quite a bit for those students. So that's something we help with, but just understanding merit and needs based are two different things, and you really have to understand what your family's situation is to see what schools you should be looking at to potentially give you the most aid.
And one more comment on the FAFSA, even if you think your student won't be eligible for any need-based aid, the universities institutions will still not extend an award letter until they have that information on file, because otherwise it would be them taking your word for it that you don't need any of their assistance, but they won't want to extend their funds to you if they think the federal government might first. So
Yep.
even if you think it won't be a benefit, you still have to get that done. So it is advised to get that done earlier than later.
Yep. All right, I think we have an example next. Perfect. So this is an example of an award letter, I believe, from Illinois State. Yep, says it at the top here. So this is fun. So these are all different. There's definitely not a standardized template for what every school will send you, and that's why you really have to caution and slow down to see specifically what you're being offered. What the student's being offered. So each school should at least show the total cost of attendance. So we see for Illinois State, 34,602. That's, about a quarter of the way down where it adds up, transportation, books and supplies, all that stuff. It's 34,600 we're saying here. This student, based on their situation, was granted some grants and scholarships totaling about 15,000. Okay. Now that should be pretty clear. Okay, that's that, dare we say, the free money, right? Okay, what's they're knocking off of that 34.6. All right, that's clearly defined as an estimated grants and scholarship. Now this is where that kind of throws people that don't, slow down and read would see, this student loans, and this is what we were talking about. They are offering $5,500 to the student. That is not free money. That is a loan. Yes, it says loan, but you'd be surprised, so definitely slow down and understand what exactly that 5,500 is and who's responsible for that and when, right? So that is definitely a loan there. Going down, it does a good summarizes at the end. After grants and scholarships, about 13,000 taken off if the student in this case applied and received that $5,500 in loans, the balance after the federal student loans basically to the parents or somebody would be due about 74, 7,500. Okay. So once again, we did have a slide a few sheets back that, could have potentially estimated that before we even, applied, toured the school and all that stuff. The idea is to get a example of an estimate to what this award letter would potentially say months before we go through all that process. So, and you
Mhm.
notice it says unsubsidized. That means that the interest is accruing as soon as the student disperses that loan. And we'll talk about that in a second. But this is just a good example that details all the who's paying for what, basically.
Mhm. And one more comment before we pass on this. Under the estimated grants and scholarships, you can see some of the grants that say year one. There are certain grants and scholarships that are offered maybe for first year students. I see that a lot with private institutions that maybe are significantly more than they will be for future years. So it's always good to dig in a little bit and get some more information. Okay, that's great. They're giving us $6,000 this year. That might not be the case for sophomore through senior year. So it's just good to plan for instead of assuming that every year will look like this year.
Yeah. Okay, this is the fun one. So this is an actual award letter from Notre Dame. We see the total cost of attendance once again, $86,000. This student was actually able to get almost $80,000 off with a net price of $6,600. Okay. After some loan assistance, and I believe there's some work study in there. I think we may have cut it off there, but total remaining amount was less than $1,000 per year for Notre Dame. So, you know, obviously this is not going to apply to everybody, but this is certainly a fun example to see that, that sticker price really it matters some, but it could matter a lot, and for others it could not matter much at all based on their situation. So once again, the whole point is here, don't be discouraged by that. At least talk to somebody about, trying to estimate, use the college scorecard. You know, if you're a client of ours, we can do this service for you, and kind of review potentially what that award letter would say to see if it's even worth, considering, applying. All right, so we'll get into the fun stuff now. Federal student loans. So this is really, really, really important. So we have to understand if there's a funding gap, which to be frank, most families are going to have a funding gap. Okay. Who is taking out what? What's the interest rate? When do we have to pay these guys? What's going on? Right. So the first one, once again, federal student loans. These are direct loans to the student, okay? And they are limited per year. So as we saw in that award letter, the freshman year is 5,500, then 6,500 for sophomore year, 7,500 for junior and senior year that the student can take out each year. So As you'll see, each July 1st, the interest rates reset. So being in a higher interest rate environment, we see these loans are currently at 6.5% for undergraduate borrowers and 8% for graduate borrowers. So how this works is as soon as they're dispersed per semester, they are going to accrue interest. Okay. Um, if they're unsubsidized. Of course, if they're subsidized, that just means that the interest is not accruing as long as you're enrolled at least half time, like we're saying there. Now, as these add up and stack, basically, when you have to start making a repayment is going to be that 6 months grace period after retirement, or excuse me, graduation. So you used to talk about retirement planning after graduation before payments are scheduled to begin. Now we have another slide about the different repayment plans that you can from the federal side, okay, from the federal loans. But the standard plan, just think a 10-year amortization schedule, right? Graduate with $30,000 of debt, average interest rates and all that say is 6%. Plug that into an amortization schedule that's, I don't know, 300, $400 a month, whatever. Okay, so that's going to be the standard repayment schedule. First month, first payment due 6 months after that post graduation. Okay, so that's kind of the standard from the student's perspective. Now, these are the fun ones. So the Parent Plus loans. So if you think back to one of those slides where we looked at the spreadsheet of, who's on the hook for the remaining funding gap after the student can only take out so much. This is where it gets scary, and we've seen this on award letters where they say, "Don't worry, parents, for any remaining funding gap, you can take out a Parent Plus loan." Okay, and I'm gonna skip to the fun part. Down at the bottom, the maximum plus loan you can borrow is the cost of attendance at your school, your child, that your child applies to. So Notre Dame costs $86,000. Say they didn't get any merit aid, and they came back to say, hey, we only have $5,000, so you know there's a remaining gap of $80,000. They could go to the federal government and apply for an $80,000 loan for that first year. So basically, the limit doesn't exist for how much you can borrow as a plus loan. If the school costs that much, you can borrow that much, right? Is what that is saying. Okay, which is just as financial planners, that scares us that there's basically an unlimited borrowing amount for basically whatever the school costs, right? And we want to have a huge discussion on this, but that worries me to say, well, what's stopping the schools from increasing their cost of attendance, knowing that these families can continue to get the loans, because that's the limit, right? So anyway, as you can see here, if those have read ahead at the top, oh, go back, please.
Sorry.
The interest rate currently is over 9%. Okay, for these Parent Plus loans. Now, that's the interest rate, and actually the APY would actually be even higher because there's an origination fee of 4.25%, as you can see there to start. So um, these scare us, right? Especially families that probably shouldn't be taking on any loans, for their children and can't, need to prioritize their retirement first. These scare us. So I'm not saying never take these out, but definitely caution, caution, caution when you see a Parent Plus loan, because once again, you'll be able to receive these. Parents will be able to receive these absolutely. It scares us when we see these because we've seen these hundreds of thousands of dollars truly. I've seen two and a quarter, 250,000 for parents that have put three kids through school and they're literally continuing to work because of that payment being higher than what their mortgage is. So scare us, definitely be cautious when applying for these. Now, when to make payments. So once again, you can request a deferment for these, but as soon as it's dispersed, interest will accrue. Okay, so each semester as these disperse, interest will accrue on the loan. So now you can request as a parent, this is as a parent, right? So there is no subsidized, unsubsidized. They're unsubsidized. They will accrue interest. The only thing you can request is what's called a deferment, where you say, hey, don't make me pay on that, right, until my student's done. Government's very happy to do that. Say, yep, sure, you bet. Um, but that interest is going to accrue once again. So the other terrible part about this, as you'll see at the end, they can capitalize that interest. What that means is any accrued interest over those 4 years, say the student was in school, when they go to amortizing that remaining balance, they'll add that to principal and add that to the principal balance, right? So you'll end up paying interest on your interest if you just let these guys accrue. So definitely a lot of things to be aware of and things to slow down when you're hitting the buttons to disperse these loans. Repayment options, I'm gonna be honest, this is a complete mess right now, truly, with changing of administrations and just truly how the previous administration created the SAVE plan. So there are four, well, I should say there's three, but SAVE plan is still out there, but there's four basically income-driven repayment plans that are based on your income, family size, and that's basically it. What type of loans you had, when they were dispersed, and things like that to try and say, well, if I have these big student loans, what can I do as a student to pay a little bit less based on your income? And the big thing that we're going to guide people to is that loan simulator at the bottom. So if you have it's your same FAFSA or studentaid.gov login, going in there to do the loan simulator is extremely helpful to say, hey, this is where I'm at now. What other repayment plans can I apply for to make these payments a little bit smaller or manageable, I should say. Now, these generally are for students. This is not for parents. Okay, so as far as I know, the only income-driven repayment plan available for Parent Plus loans is ICR, that third one there, and that's generally the least favorable. So there's a lot to this, guys. To enroll in an IDR plan, an income-driven repayment plan, you have to consolidate your loan. So if you want to think about it, a 4-year undergraduate graduate degree, 2 semesters per year, call it, that would be eight total loans, right? If you took out a loan each semester, that's eight separate loans when you log in that you see. Consolidating would say take all eight of those loans, put it together in one, and re-amortize it. Okay. That allows you to qualify for potentially an IDR plan. And once again, the loan simulator does do a good job of explaining that hey, to be eligible for these plans, you have to consolidate your loans, and that's a whole nother ball of wax as if you should do that or not, and what the advantages are, disadvantages there too. So, but a lot to know, a lot to know. But the big thing I would say is not all of these plans are available for Parent Plus loans as they are for the students. Um, the fixed repayment plans, like you can do extended. So up to like 25 or 30 years, which is just crazy. You can extend the payments. That just obviously means more interest, okay? Graduate rated payment repayment plan would be, it starts at $100 a month, and in 2 years it goes up to 150 and 200 and so forth. Once again, just go to the loan simulator and explain all the options. Ideally, you work with a financial planner to tell you what one makes the most sense for you, because there are plans that, can give you a lower payment, but that's not always the point. Just by, refinancing your house, for example, or your car, you can have a lower payment, but all that's doing is kicking the can down the road and most of the time costing you more interest, right? So just solving for the lowest payment may feel good at the time, but doesn't really solve the problem of the outstanding balance of the loan, right? So just caution when you're searching for the lowest payment. And literally one of the features on that loan simulator is find me the lowest payment, which is great, but I don't think your people understand the long-term consequences of doing that, because that could be the extended repayment plan for 20 years. It's like, well, yeah, that's going to give you the lowest payment because they're stretching that um, balance over the longest period, but obviously we're paying a much more interest on that loan too. So anyway, great resource to start the conversation, but certainly I wouldn't enroll on any plans unless you thoroughly understand those, and otherwise talk to your financial planner to make sure that makes the most sense for your situation.
Mhm. So now that we have an understanding of how to decide what we want to save or what school we're going to opt for and what resources we want to use, we'll get into some common saving strategies. Most common, people are looking at 529s, being that they are tax advantaged and they are very flexible compared to other options. We'll go into detail on these a little bit in the next few slides. But there are a few other alternatives that people can look at, one being custodial accounts like an UTMA or an UGMA. A reason why somebody might not opt for these are because the gifts on these are irrevocable, meaning that once you move the funds to the account for the beneficiary, it is a completed gift and the beneficiary on the account cannot be changed. Whereas a 529, you could change the beneficiary on the account with certain stipulations. And then once the student becomes the age of majority in their state, the funds are theirs. They can pull them out and use them as they wish. So if at that point in time you think, oof, I don't know if I want them to have access to that money, well, your hands are a little bit tied. A third option that people could look at would be using a taxable investment account, which you retain control of those funds and you can decide, well, maybe they're not going to go to school, they're entrepreneurial. I want to help fund this. I want to help give them a down payment to a house. You have the flexibility to do that, but you don't have the advantages of you're paying tax on any of the gains over time on those funds, and it is not considered a gift until you actually physically disperse funds to the student, whether they are a student or not. So everybody has their own motivation for why they'd go one route or the other, but we'll go a little more into 529s because of them being a common avenue for education savings.
Yeah, I would just add that think of these in order being the least flexible at top to the most flexible at the bottom, right? So to us as financial planners, the greater percentage or the larger dollar amount you want to contribute to a child's education, the more you should look at 529 plans, right? So somebody looking to put away, $50 a month, maybe a grandparent for their grandchild's education, to me, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to do a 529 plan because the tax advantages are not going to outweigh the restrictions you have for those accounts. But you have a grandma and grandpa that want to gift $50,000 a year, $50,000 to a grandchild to jumpstart their education. It's like, okay, maybe that does make sense when they're young, right? We have a number of years to let that grow tax deferred and potentially be distributed tax free. Those come in handy quite a bit. But for younger parents, Alyssa and I would be in that boat. It's like, well, I don't know, we're the student, would a child go to college? What does that look like? Maybe we need those assets potentially in the future for our own goals. The taxable investment account gives you a ton of flexibility, still in the parent's name, still owned, can be gifted out in the future to the children if that's what we want to do. It can be used for obviously our expenses as a parent if needed in the meantime. So tons of flexibility there. Nothing to say that, as that student gets into junior high or high school, it's looking more clear on their career path that you can open a 529 later and reallocate that money in that plan if you're getting serious about saving a little bit more for that student. So flexibility on the bottom and more restrictions at the top as far as use of funds there.
Looking a little deeper into 529s, no annual contribution limit. So whereas you might want to contribute like an UMA, for example, you $2,000 a year. If you're looking to contribute more significantly than that, the 529 doesn't have an actual annual contribution limit. There are maximum account balances, though, when new contributions will no longer be allowed. It does vary by state. So, for example, Illinois is 500,000 and Wisconsin is $545,500. And I have not seen a 529 up there yet. I'll let you guys know if I do. And for example, Illinois, $10,000 single, $20,000 married filing jointly for state tax deductions for contributions. So there can be benefits to contributing to 529s. In Wisconsin, that's 5,000. And the one benefit to this is that accounts are growing over time. You can play around, you can select the investment lineup within your 529s, ideally with help from a financial advisor. And you can gift more sizably. You can gift up to 5-year limitation, $95,000 you could put in at once into a 529, and then that would be considered a 5-year average for gifting to the student. you can change the beneficiary. So if you had three kids and there maybe was a large gap, you could waterfall the funds down and update a beneficiary later on if there are excess funds remaining for a beneficiary. One note on this I think is important to consider and easy to overlook, especially maybe as a grandparent, if you are looking for um, thinking of this in terms of estate planning, because 529s can be powerful tools for gifting and estate planning also. If you have a large 529 with one beneficiary and something were to happen, who will be next in line to oversee those funds, and will they be equally split to other kids, other grandkids, or kids that you maybe would want to make sure it is equitably split between. Um, Timing requirements, like Nate said, if we wanted to focus on flexibility up front, you're pretty wishy-washy. You don't know if you love the idea of jumping into a 529, maybe with the horizon it would be until college. Maybe you wanted to wait until you got a little closer. There's generally no holding period, federal or state, for duration of time. Wisconsin does have a 365-day holding period. So if you have a freshman, sophomore, and you're more seriously talking about college and it looks like it's going to be a realistic goal within a few years, maybe that's the time that we decide to start contributing to 529. I think the biggest thing to remember is that early planning, as in most things, is key, and it's better to save somewhere than not at all. So ideally, if you do know college is a good route for you, 529s do have favorable features.
Yep. And one question we get, um, back a slide, please, would
Yep.
be, what's a qualified educational expense? What can I take money out for? And that's the link at the bottom there. IRS publication 970 kind of details that. So you'll see that referenced quite a bit. But that's a common question we get, and I would just encourage you to look that up and kind of read through it. Your accountant or CPA should be able to tell you that as well, but that's a common question. What can I take money from? So um, the timing requirements. So, someone in Illinois, for example, could say, well, hey, I just got this bill for Northwestern, and it's saying I owe $20,000. Can I just put $20,000 in Johnny's 529 plan and then the next day request a distribution? So I get a state tax deduction at 5%. So that's a little bit of money there, right? And then distribute it. Yes, you could in Illinois. Wisconsin says, no, 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 no. If you put money in a 529 plan, it has to be there for a year before you can distribute it for a qualified educational expense. So, we'll be honest, we'll get in this in a few slides. Each state handles these plans completely different than what the federal government says you can do with them. So, once again, with a few things with education planning, I want to say a mess with 529 plans, but it's certainly not uniform across states. So definitely slow down and understand timing requirements, contribution. Once again, there's not limits, but the 95,000 we're describing there is a 5-year gift averaging. So this is more, contributions is more of an annual exclusion, lifetime exemption, some estate planning limits to be aware of, not necessarily contribution limits where the plan won't accept the money. You just have to be hyper aware if you're doing larger contribution, what does that mean from a state tax perspective,
Mhm.
from a estate planning perspective, I should say.
Mhm. And because like most people's concerns with saving for college is, what if my kid doesn't go to college? What if they get a full ride? There's been a lot of flexibility in, and again, we'll get to this a little bit by state. You can use some funds toward student loan repayment up to $10,000. You can use it for primary education if you wanted to use funds at maybe go to a private school. And most recently with Secure Act 2.0, you can actually roll funds from a 529 into a Roth IRA once it's met certain stipulations. Though the Roth IRA has to be owned by the beneficiary of the 529. They do have to have the student, the beneficiary of the 529 would have to have income to offset the contribution, and it is subject to annual contribution limits for Roth IRAs. And you can do that only up to 35,000. So if you did have some excess funds and rather than changing the beneficiary, you wanted to help jumpstart retirement savings, you could contribute that to a Roth IRA. So the account does have to be open for 15 years and funds must sit for at least 5 within the 529 before they can be contributed. But there's been changes to make it a little bit more enticing and a little less scary, feeling like you're possibly contributing funds without the ability to, if your student doesn't go to college without the ability of accessing them penalty free. And if your student is offered full ride or large scholarship, you are allowed to withdraw funds from 529 up to the amount of the aid that they've been given without penalty. So it is an incentive to save for education, which is ultimately what these plans are designed for. They're not designed to feel like a scary set of handcuffs, but they are a tool to be aware of all these little features so that you know what you are saving into.
All right, here's the fun part. So this map is once again showing that, all the things we went over in the previous two slides for the most part were like from a federal level. How does the federal government view 529 plans? What this shows is each state has a different ruling on what qualified distributions are. So if we look at this, we'll pick on our three states or we can include Minnesota too and Iowa. So Illinois and Minnesota, what this is saying are obviously labeled yellow. What this means is the only qualified distributions from a 529 plan for those states listed in yellow there. Now these are residents of those states. I should say that actually, not necessarily the schools in that state. If you're a resident of one of these states, um, only undergraduate and graduate expenses can be distributed if you're a resident of the states labeled in yellow. Okay. Now you'll see Alyssa just talked about, well, what about primary school, K through 12 tuition private school, right? Well, that's actually you're able to do that in Wisconsin and Iowa, for example, but not in Illinois or Minnesota. Okay, that those states say, well, that's great, federal government, but we're not allowing those K through 12 expenses to be distributed from 529 plans. Okay. So the orange ones would be you could do undergraduate expenses in K-12. Green would be good. So Iowa and Wisconsin, it's pretty easy. You can do undergraduate expenses, K through 12 tuition, plus student loans. So this is interesting. $10,000 lifetime limit per beneficiary per sibling tax free. So once again, let's think about Wisconsin. Say you were have $10,000 left on your student loan and you haven't distributed from your 529 plan to do that, couldn't you make a 529 contribution, get a state tax deduction, then wait a year and distribute it to pay off the loan? By this chart, yes, you could. Iowa, I don't believe, has a timing requirement. So someone who had $10,000 left on a student loan could make a contribution to a 529 plan, get a state tax deduction, and there soon after take a tax-free distribution to pay off that loan. So once again, we see these things and get excited about, oh, we can use it for K-12 tuition. Unfortunately, not in Illinois. Hey, we can do it to pay off student loan debt. Unfortunately, not in Illinois. So now these can always change and vary, but once again, as we sit here today, this is the current kind of heat map as to how each state views distributions from the different plans there. So important to keep in mind.
We did include some of the resources that we about or mentioned earlier too. So once this gets sent out, these will be listed alongside the other slides included. And we can go through any of these with you if you do have any questions on these.
We're open up to questions here at the
There
end.
we
So
go.
if anyone has any questions, feel free to use the raised hand feature at the bottom. We can unmute your line or go ahead and type in the chat box or the Q&A if you've had any written questions you'd like to submit. So, all right, we got a raised hand here. And then Jordan, I'm going to unmute you here and allow you to ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yep, we got you, Jordan. Go ahead.
Does veterans benefits like GI Bill or post 9/11, I guess those are the same thing, factor into what assistance I will or will not get based on my income or other factors that you discussed?
Good question. It will, but not in that software that I demonstrated. I don't believe they have veterans benefits in there. That just looks purely from a income and assets perspective, not factoring in any veterans benefits.
College
Okay.
scorecard does include that. Let me jump back. Which again, this is just a general, it does discuss military and GI benefits. So college scorecard will include that at least for a ballpark estimate. College Aid Pro, I was not sure of.
Yeah, good question. Any other questions, either written or verbally? We can unmute your line if you have anything you'd like to ask. But I guess to summarize, the big thing is definitely going to be do your research either through College Scorecard or come to us if your clients to do some general research on what, you know, schools may be best to start resourcing. We get you an estimated net cost per year, get your funding gap over the 4-year period and apply it to your financial plan to see if it's setting you, the parents up for success or failure truly when we look at student loans. So that's kind of the big take home point. We can talk about savings, as far as if you have younger children, what accounts make the most sense to get you up to your goal as far as percentage of funding their school, a dollar amount, what have you. We can kind of talk through that as well. So the idea is to do as much work on the front end and leave less room for unfortunate feelings between you and your children, on the back end when it comes to deciding on a school. So. But with that, I think if there's no other questions, we're in the webinar, and this will be recorded as always and posted on our websites. And then definitely keep your ears out and check your email boxes for other Klaas U webinars in the future. So thanks everyone for attending.